For our next lesson, we're going to take a look at positioning. So I'm going to fold this back up a little bit over here on my CSS styles and make sure that I can see my files panel. And let's take a look at DW environment.html. Now it looks probably a little bit different than when we saw it last in an earlier chapter. We've got pretty much every type of container that we could put on our page in this particular file. So for instance, I am going to go to my CSS styles panel here and fold up my files. And let's take a look at what we have. So from earlier, we took this file that had a few little elements in it, so a paragraph and a header and a subhead and a list item and some links. And we went to our page properties in our property inspector and we added our CSS properties from there. They ended up in between our head tags in our code view. And now I can see by looking at this in my styles panel, I don't even have to know that. If I take a look at a page and I've got these little brackets here that tell me that this is an actual style that's embedded in my page. So I can go to my code and confirm that yes indeed, that is all embedded in my page. So I've got all the elements that we had styled before, and we added a few more little containers. So I've got container 1, and that is just my regular container. It has a margin left auto and a margin right auto and a little bit of padding. If I were to click on my page here, I see that I've got, a wrapper around the majority of my elements on my page, and in that wrapper I just have a background color and a little bit of padding and a width of a percentage. So for my container 1 that I see here on my page, if I click on it in my tag selector, I see that I have some padding and I have a margin along with this. I've given it an margin left auto and a margin right auto just so that I could center that inside of my other container. It still has some of the other things that we styled earlier. Inside of that, I've got another container. Now this is my container 4, and if I take a look at my property inspector, I see that it doesn't have an ID name. It doesn't have any overflow. I know just by looking at these containers that it's not an absolutely positioned item because I would have to have my left and my top in here as well. And so when I click on it over here, I see that it is a relative position. So I can give that a left or a right or exactly where I would like that to be positioned then relative to the parent container. If I scroll down a little bit, I'll notice that I have another container down here. So this is my container 3, and if I click inside of it, I see that I have a background color, of course, and a positioning of fixed. Now, looking at it right here in the file, this doesn't look all that exciting until I actually go to my live view. Now I see it's really over top of everything else. And if I scroll on my page, then I also notice that it is basically then locked to the bottom of my page, and everything else then will scroll underneath it because it's fixed on my page, so it's going to stay put. And I've given it a position of 0 for the bottom. Click back on here again. And so that will always then be stuck to the bottom of my page. Now if I scroll up a little bit here, you'll see 2 other containers, and I'm going to turn back off my live view again so we can take a better look at these. Now this should be a little bit interesting. So this should look to you very different than the rest of my containers, and if I click on it, you're noticing me grabbing that and moving that around. That is my container 2. Now I've moved this, so that's changing over here as well. So I see that my left 229 And if I grab this and I move that here, then that's going to be my left of 68 because it is absolutely positioned on my page. It's using a mapping to my upper left-hand corner of my browser, so it is going to be absolutely where I put it on the page. I have another absolutely positioned item here, and you'll notice that these things have a stacking order to them, and I have visibility to these as well, so they can overlap, etc. And if I click over here on my AP elements, that I see that that one has a name, but this one does not. So that one is just my container 2, and that's just simply something that I drew on my page. If you take a look at your insert panel, and I will pull this down a little bit, we have common, layout, forms, data, spry, in context editing, text, and favorites. I'm in my layout part of my panel. I have two little pieces to this. I've got a standard view, the way we're working now, and an expanded view that allows me, when I'm working with tables, to be able to separate the table a little bit so that I can click in between my cells inside of a table. I can insert a div tag from here, the same thing as my insert layout objects and div tag. I can draw an AP div, so that's my absolutely positioned div, and if I just select that and I click inside of my page and I can draw, and then when I select it, I'm just going to simply give it a background color. You can choose any color you like. So I see that, as I fold this back up again for a moment, I see that my new div is named app div 2. That's fine. I also notice that my container 2 is still unnamed, so let me fix that now. So in my property inspector, I will say that is my original. So now I actually see that over in my AP elements. So for instance, this is a lot like Photoshop. So if you're familiar with Photoshop and you're used to moving items around, I see that I've got a stacking order. And if I grab that and I give it a different Z index, we'll give it 5. Now that goes up to the top of my page, and it is now above all of my other items. I also have a visibility. So if I click over here by my eyeball, I can turn the visibility on or off. I'll turn that back on. I go back over to my CSS styles, and with that particular container, so that is my absolute. Now I've given it an overflow of auto. So basically what that means is if I take a look at my page here and I go to my code, I see I actually have a fair amount of text in here. But because I have given that an overflow of auto, not until I go to my live view, and now I've got some scroll bars, and I could now scroll to see the rest of my content. Not necessarily very attractive, is it? But you see this fairly often in web design, more often than not from a Flash developer rather than a CSS page. But if you have to, you can do it. So let's actually take a look at my panel here, and I'll click on my edit, and let's just go to positioning. So again, I've got absolute, fixed, relative, and static. Now, static I don't need to choose unless I'm making sure that it is static. Static is just the default. So the div that is wrapping around my entire page is indeed just a static without actually choosing static. It's a static container. So my absolute gives me my absolute values. My fixed will fix it to a particular part of my page. Relative is relative to my parent container. Relative is great to use for things like logos inside of a container or some item that you then want to position precisely inside of the parent container. Now there's one other thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about positioning, and that is our float. Now we talked about floats a little bit. Let me just get rid of some of this content. Don't need some of these containers any longer. So I do have an item here that was my container 1. Let's go ahead and change this just a little bit so we can see what that would look like with a float. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that rule. I'm going to go to my box container and let's get rid of my auto on this. Here, let's give this an actual value. Let's say 300 pixels. And maybe just 5 on the padding. And if I just click apply, now that is over in line with the other items on my page. If we take that and we tell it to float left and I click apply, you'll see that it doesn't necessarily move on my page because it's not above any of the other items on my page, but the container itself no longer basically sees that whole entire float because we don't have a clear underneath that at all. So let's go ahead and say OK to that so we can see it overlapping that other container. If I go to my code, and I'm just going to make sure that I don't have a clear in here, so we'll just basically make something simple here. So right after that particular div, I will type a BR and let it just say clear and all. And I will finish that out, and it goes ahead and puts the / in there for me. I will refresh and go to my design, and now that is wrapped back around the rest of my items on my page. Whenever I have that float, I have to clear it at some point so that the other things that are on the page will look like I expect them to look. And the container will wrap around all of the items. So now we've just had a beginning look into the different types of positioning in CSS.